Hello, I am back again. And again, I'm not going to share a poem. I'm actually going to share a story. This story is a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than the last story that I shared, but it's an awesome story. It's one that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. It's been a long time in the making. And when people say, "Tell me about your story," "Tell me how you met God," for me, it's very complicated, very interconnected, very deep, very rich. It's awesome, but it's hard to tell in a short form. And yeah, so I've been doing my best over all these years to share my stories, and that's really what my poetry actually is, anyways. So, yeah, but this is my poetry story that I'm going to share. And it's really hard to tell a lot of stories because they kind of interconnect with other stories. And so as I share this story, it interconnects with my story of how I met God, but I'm not going to really be talking about that angle of it. But you might notice that there is quite an interconnection in my mental health story. So I could also tell a story of my mental health story. I'm not going to do that right now, and I don't know if I ever will, or, because it's very complex and there's a lot to it. So, and a lot of it comes out in the poetry too. It's just that in the poetry, it's coming out isolated versus kind of in a concise, start to finish type of story. Anyways, I'm moving out of the track here. So let me get back and share my poetry story. The reason I'm sharing this right now is that I just did my very first poetry workshop a few weeks ago, and I'm gearing up to do another one. It went very, very well, and I'm so excited. It was one of the best days of my life because it really felt like after such a long time in the making and in the preparing for this that I opened that a door was opened that I walked through, and I could see a great future through this door for me in this way. And it was so exciting. And I felt like I was getting to be the fullest expression of myself and who I am and what makes me me and what I have to offer others. And it was just exhilarating. And everybody seemed to really, really enjoy themselves. And I had asked for feedback, and the feedback was exhilaratingly fantastic. It was really affirming, but it was also really helpful. And so somebody had mentioned that in the next workshop, and yes, they'd be back, and in the next workshop, they'd like to see me spend a bit more time talking about my own poetry story. And so at any rate, I'm practicing here because I think it's a good story. So without further ado, let me begin. So I started writing poetry when I was a teenager. Probably in my middle teen years, yeah, maybe even 13, 14, I guess. So maybe the beginning of my teen years. I remember loving English class and loving my English teachers. And my favorite part of all, I loved reading books and I loved doing work about that. But I remember my favorite was the poetry. We would do these poetry projects and I would just eat it up. I still have some of them. I've kept them. I haven't kept a lot of things from my past, but those I have. And I think the things we keep and hold on to share a lot about where our heart is at and our passion. So yeah, I started writing poetry. I don't know exactly when, but I know that I had this little journal book that I still have, and I would write poems in it. And I don't think I understood at the time what it was serving me until much later down the road. Now I can look back and I can tell you that it was a safe place, the safest place I knew that I could turn to and pour these things out. It was exploring my thoughts and my feelings. It was exploring these deeper places within me that could perceive things and connect things, and wanted to explore that in poetry. And I would see things and they'd touch me, and anyways, and I would think I was processing emotions, processing my story long before I understood what I was doing. I was just doing it. And so I would write these poems kind of secretly. I was busy living a life of in a different direction, not really connecting with the artist self in me or the creative self in me or the spiritual self in me, but I was busy doing other things. And that's other parts of my story for another day. But yeah, and I would often share these poems just with a few people, and I would get great response, like, oh wow, that's such a good poem. And I even had one poem was published in in my English class. The English teacher was like, oh, there's a young poets poetry anthology book if anybody wants to submit a poem, and mine was selected to be, I think a lot of people were selected, but mine was selected and it was published in a poetry anthology book. Yeah, and so I wrote these poems, and I actually look back now at some of those poems, and they break my heart for kind of like what this young girl was struggling with and processing, the depths of pain in her heart, and that I didn't even realize. It's almost like it was my only way of expressing those things, and I didn't even know that's what I was doing, but that is what I was doing. And so I wrote in this book. And then what happened was, fast forward to when I was about 19 years old, and I had just started dating my now husband. And there was a lot of trauma going on in my past. There always had been, but there was quite a heightened period of my story at this time. And I'm about 19 years old. I've just started dating my husband, and I was at this time experiencing my first manic episode, which resulted in a diagnosis pretty quickly of bipolar disorder. Now, I could tell you the mental health story, and there's so much there. It's very rich, but that's not what I'm here to do. But this is an interconnection. So in this manic phase and the trauma that was going on, I wrote a poem, but it was a different kind of style than I had ever written a poem in. And so when I shared it with a few trusted people, they didn't seem to understand it. And I mistakenly, and of course there was all kinds of stuff going on, but mistakenly I made the conclusion that I must not be a good writer. I suck. I should stop. And so I stopped. Now, when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I was given the medication to start taking, lithium, and it was helpful in doing what it needed to do at that time. There was so much trauma, but anyways, I'm not telling the mental health story, I'm telling the poetry story. So I began taking meds, and they essentially started to help in a lot of ways. But one of the ways that it wasn't helpful, except for it was at the time, but now it's a different story, is that it began to really mute me. And I often refer to the years when I was on lithium. I'm currently not using medications. Again, this isn't my mental health story. But so that when I was using lithium, it was effective and helpful for what I needed at that time in my life. And I'm thankful for it. But one of the things it did was it completely muted my sensitivities and my perception and my creativity. And that was very depressing. But I just carried on, and it took a while for me to get used to feeling that way, which was pretty cut off really from a lot of depths within myself. But within that, I stopped writing. I didn't write anymore, so it kind of helped. I'm a writer, I suck, I should stop writing, and I'm not feeling it anyway. So I just stopped writing for many, many years. So then fast forward, my husband and I, we dated for a long time, then we got married and had children. And so in my first time of becoming a mom, I was really experiencing a lot of mental health turbulence, let's say. And I was having postpartum depression and anxiety. And I had actually weaned off of my medications prior to this, but I had been aware that this was going to potentially be a rock in the waves, right, in the water. And it was just not quite the way I was expecting it was going to be. And so I actually made it through pregnancy and childbirth without medications, but it was in the aftermath, which I wasn't expecting, where it kind of hit. And I quickly had to get back on meds for a little while, and then I weaned off, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in this introduction to parenthood, and I'm having postpartum depression and anxiety, and things are starting to kind of brew, like the underbelly of all of my trapped up stuff that I hadn't dealt with was starting to kind of rumble in becoming a mother. And there's so much I could say, especially if I was kind of talking about my spiritual or even my mental health journey in this phase. But just to say that then my second son was born in 2012. And at that point, or kind of slightly before, I began to have a very significant experience. Again, kind of part of the spiritual and mental health journey as well, was that I had kind of this like massive and sudden and powerful like spiritual awakening. And I've actually since discovered terms that I find fascinating because I think they describe what was happening to me, of spiritual emergency and spiritual emergence. Now, I would be starving and excited to talk more about this. And so it's hard for me. I have to be like, nope, this is not the story you're telling the poetry story. So, but inside of this is a lot of cool stuff that I really want to talk about. And I think the world needs to talk about along the way, but this is not right now. So I'm carrying on. So in this massive bursting sort of like stuff that's going on between my trapped trauma and what's happening spiritually and mentally at the same time, I started writing all kinds of poems. It's like I just opened up spiritually and I started having all kinds of feelings and experiences. Everything that had been muted and pushed down was coming back up, and I started having all kinds of spiritual experience. And again, I could talk about that, but part of it was that I started to write again. It was like a dam burst. And at that stage, I really felt like I had books and books and books of stories to tell, but it felt almost like I was like constipated. But all of a sudden, over time, poems just started coming out like diarrhea. And they just started coming out kind of like little bits and pieces. And that kind of got things moving. And I started writing. And since then, I've probably written over 600 poems. And they're all kind of in this different flavor or voice in a way, or different part of me that they're engaging from, as that one poem that made me think I wasn't a good writer and shut down. And so at a certain point early in that journey, I did feel guided by God to go back and find that poem. Now, I had felt so much shame and embarrassment, so it was quite a process to have to go and find that poem and dare myself to read it and stay the course with God and what God was wanting to show me about it. But as I did, I was overwhelmed with this deep sense of like, oh my goodness, this poem that I thought sucked because nobody understood it was brilliant. Like maybe my best poem ever. It was brilliant because it was like me actually trying to find words to describe and express what was happening to me at that time. And on a spiritual, emotional level, it's brilliant. And I now just cherish it. But I had to do a lot of work to kind of see that and to prepare myself to receive that stage of the journey of processing it. But it's beautiful, and it speaks a lot about the mental health part and the spiritual part. But carrying on. So I'm just looking at my notes here that I wrote. So I just started writing poems everywhere. I had to carry paper with me everywhere. It was just prolific. It just was like a dam burst, and poems started coming. I, at a certain point, felt this need to share them in a spoken way. And I didn't know anything about the art form of spoken word poetry. But of course, that entered the scene and at just the right time. And so I began to kind of explore spoken word poetry, and I started doing a little bit of performing inside of the spoken word community around me. But I was quick to encounter some pretty rough stuff that I had to process through, again, thinking it's my fault, I'm doing something wrong, I'm not good enough, whatever it was. And I don't want to get into it too much because I don't want to speak poorly about the spoken word community here, but it just wasn't the right thing for me. And so I began to sense that a direction unfolding of where I was somehow supposed to be sharing spoken word poetry in a different way for different reasons and to different people. and that was okay. And so I started to explore that journey. I did all kinds of shows that I would arrange myself at coffee shops. I would go to open mic nights at different places and really hone and practice my craft and really start to try to get a sense of what was happening and what this was all about and how to work it well. And that was a huge journey with tons of turbulence and tons of stuff to process to get me where I am now. More recently, I've written probably I think 16 books, and my 17th one is on the way. And again, there's story there, but I produce my own books. I make them by my own hand and I sell them by my own hands. But it's been a journey because I used to just print them on paper and give them away. So there's been quite a journey in moving into printing them more nicely presented and selling them, and like believing that they're worth money and like pricing them. There's been this huge, amazing story and journey of how God has led me through that. And I could tell you all of these little things, but we'd be here forever. But yeah, so I've been making these books and selling them. They are amazing. I love getting to take multiple poems and select them, curate them on a particular topic, and to string them together in some kind of way, like sort of like stop motion poetry or stop motion photography, how you take still shots and then you run them quickly and it animates them and then you can see movement. And I love curating and picking poems that are on a particular topic that, when put together just right, tell a story and paint a picture and actually show a movement of God at work in me and me at work in God at work in me, and the brilliance and beauty of that and what that has to offer other people. So yeah, I'm just checking my notes again. So I guess just like there's so much I'm just really skipping over, kind of like my book producing history and my performance history. To this day, I don't perform as often. I have done different shows and performances. I did a living room performance recently in a friend's kind of living room space, and that was just funky, wild, amazing, awesome. But it's been more recently that there's been a bit of a change in direction. And so now I'm moving in, and again, I could tell you stories inside of stories of this, but just to kind of keep it, I'm trying to be under 20 minutes here. And so I recently just had a friend reach out and say, hey, have you ever thought of doing poetry workshops? To which I said, no, I haven't. And she said, I really would like to encourage you. I'd like you to do it. I want to go to one and I want you to teach it. And so, and I want to help you. And here's how I can help you. And so I really sat with God and processed this and realized that there was something here. At about the same time, I don't like to tell people when I tried something and it failed, but here I am, because failure is something I've worked with a lot. Perfectionism, I've gone, anyways. And so failure is not what we think it is. And I've done a lot of work there. So I'm just going to lay it out because it's part of this story, is that I actually applied to do a TED Talk in Victoria, and wasn't selected because I think they had a lot of applicants and perhaps it just wasn't right, and that's okay. But it doesn't mean that I didn't have a great story. So the story that I wanted to share was called Basement Poetry for Basement Times. And so I think I'm still walking this out. So just really briefly, and this is part of what I'm sharing with my poetry workshops. So if any of this sounds exciting to you, reach out to me and ask me for more information about the poetry workshops, and stay tuned as I post more of the posters about them. But I really think it doesn't take a lot for us to look around at the world around us, even locally, but globally, and to see that we are really living in what I'm calling basement times. The stuff that everybody has just tried to stuff down personally, individually, collectively, in systems and groups is exploding. Like, it cannot be contained. We have to deal with it. We have to process it. And we have to do that individually and then collectively. It's all kind of interconnected. And you know, we've got systems overload, and you know, how do people that need access to these high end, like, you know, expensive counseling and all of that. And so I want to come in and say poetry. Poetry, poetry. When I used to be younger, I was more athletic back in the day, and I would you know, I was really into fitness, like over so, and I could tell you more about that. But anyways, and I used to play basketball and different sports, and so we would be traveling for tournaments, and I would always bring my skipping rope, very small. It fit into my luggage really easily, and then I could just go out into the parking lot, so I didn't have to go, because I used to run, but I wouldn't want to run in a city I didn't know. So this way I could just shove it into my bag and then go into the parking lot and skip for an aerobic workout. Like I really needed more when I was on a tournament for basketball. But anyways, that was where my teenage body, you know, body mind story was at that time. And so, oh, I'm going to be a little over 20 minutes, but bear with me here. I'm trying to wrap up, but it's all so good. Yeah. And so, this was so accessible, this skipping rope. It was cheap. It took up very little space. It was very easy and accessible, and it hit the mark. It did what I needed it to do. I'm proposing that actually poetry, not poetry for poetry's sake, not poetry for art's sake, like what I sometimes call museum poetry or art gallery poetry. I'm not knocking that, but that's not what I do. This is beautiful, well written, really dug into, really polished up. Some people are that kind of writer. I'm not. I am more about poetry for process. And I believe that, and this is what I'd like to lead people and encourage people in, is that I believe that poetry for process could be like the skipping rope in the luggage that is cheap, accessible for all, easy, takes up a little bit of space, and hits the mark. And it's a very creative way of looking at how we could actually affect powerful change in this day and age, when we have massive overload of all the basement stuff just exploding, like the toilet is exploding, and yet we have this overload and overwhelm of the systems within which we're supposed to access help. Which, by the way, God, Holy Spirit, get with it, because that's what has, you know, God has led me in all of this. And I want to talk more about that along the way too. I understand it's complex, and if you're not there, it's okay. I think there's still good stuff here for you. So that is what I am doing now, is I am leading people in how to write for process, how to explore their story and engage their story the way that I have. I have seen in my story with poetry, I have seen how poetry writing for me has been so powerful, so helpful and healing for growth, for experience of engaging with my story and learning and growing. And it's just been huge. And I have seen it impact me. I've seen it impact the people I have shared it with. There is so much I could say. But I think I'm just going to make sure I'm not missing anything exciting. Yeah, that's why I'm doing my poetry workshops now. And so stay tuned. But thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, drop me a personal message. Yeah. And I encourage you to grab a pen, grab a piece of paper. That's how easy it is. Pray and ask God to show you what you need to examine right now poetically, and go for it. But hey, if you need a little bit more, come and check out my workshops. Okay, I'll see you later. Thanks, friends. Bye-bye.